Thank you for choosing to listen to horror stories at Radio of Nightmare. If you enjoyed chilling tales, please like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any frightening stories. Now prepare yourself as we are about to embark on a haunting journey. Let's begin. In a hushed, trembling voice, Lillian Porter shared the story she'd been repeating for over 3 decades, each time without a single deviation. Recently, she recounted it once more to a high schooler from Albuquerque who was collecting local ghost tales for a Halloween project. He recorded her story, and this is what he transcribed. I'll tell you exactly as it happened. I know what I saw. It was a chilly March evening in 1986, back in the quiet town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Even after all these years, I remember every sound, every scent, every single haunting image from that night. I was only 13 then, but those moments are seared into my memory. My father and I were returning home after a school play I had been in. Since my mother had passed when I was a baby, it was always just the two of us. My father, a strong-willed mechanic, had worked hard his whole life. After my mother's death, he never considered another partner. He held my mother in his heart with a love so deep that even after she was gone, he could never let her go. I apologize for getting emotional. It's difficult to talk about this, but people should know what happened that night. It was early evening, probably around 8. We were driving down a desolate stretch of road just outside of town, surrounded by the endless New Mexican desert. Socorro was a town where everyone knew everyone, but this part of the road felt entirely alone. As we drove, we talked about dinner plans, and then, out of nowhere, my father froze mid-sentence, staring out the window with a look I'd never seen before. His face, normally so calm, had gone ghostly pale, as if he'd seen something that chilled him to the core. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding, and there, in the distance, I saw her, a little girl, slowly walking away from the road. She looked around 6 or 7 years old, with tangled hair and an old-fashioned dress, her small form a strange silhouette against the desert twilight. What is that? My father muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He began to pull the truck to the side of the road, his face a mixture of confusion and dread. Dad, are you sure we should stop? I whispered, unease knotting in my stomach. Every instinct in me screamed that something was terribly wrong, yet he just looked at me, his eyes filled with a strange determination. We can't just leave her there. If she's lost or hurt, it's a long, cold walk back to town, he replied, his voice firm. But maybe we should go back and get Sheriff Collins to take a look, I suggested, my voice wavering. The sheriff's station was at least a 20-minute drive, and in that time the girl could easily disappear into the desert. But my father was stubborn. He turned off the truck, got out, and slowly started walking toward the girl. Frozen with fear, I stayed by the truck, watching him as he approached her. As he got closer, the girl stopped moving. Without turning around, she simply stood there, waiting. My father paused just a few feet behind her. They both stood there, perfectly still, as if locked in some silent, chilling understanding. Then, without a word, my father turned back and walked toward me, his face drained of all expression. What happened? Dad, what did you see? I asked, panic rising in my voice. But he didn't respond. He simply got back into the truck, started it up, and drove away, his gaze fixed on the road, his mouth a tight line. When I looked back, the girl was gone, vanished into the empty desert. The silence on our drive home was suffocating. My father wouldn't even look at me, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. By the time we reached the house, it was completely dark. He got out of the truck and went straight inside without saying a word. Shaken, I sat there, alone, unsure if I wanted to follow him into that silent, shadow-filled house. After a few minutes, I finally gathered the courage to step out of the truck. The house was pitch black, and the door was left ajar. I called out, "Dad," but there was only silence. The chill in the air seemed to thicken, and every instinct told me to turn and run. Yet I couldn't leave my father alone. I took a deep breath, stepping into the dark house. The air felt unnaturally cold, and every creak under my feet echoed in the silence. I called out again, "Dad?" There was no response. The quiet was thick, unnerving. I thought of leaving, of running to a neighbor's house, but our closest neighbor was a mile away, and the dark night outside didn't feel any safer. With trembling hands, I flipped on the kitchen light, hoping the brightness would chase away the shadows. But as the light flickered to life, my eyes caught a glimpse of something chilling in the corner of the room. The little girl from the desert, standing there with her back to me, unmoving. In an instant, I felt all the air leave my lungs. She looked as if she'd been standing there the entire time, silently watching. Before I could even process what I was seeing, she vanished, disappearing as though she had never been there at all. My body shook, and I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, a scream escaping my lips. "Dad!" I cried out, louder this time, desperate for any sign of him. Still, there was only silence. The fear clawed at me, but I couldn't abandon him. Slowly, I started making my way up to his room, flipping on every light switch as I went, forcing myself to believe that light could keep the horror at bay. His room was at the end of the hallway upstairs, and as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I called out once more, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Dad, please answer me." There was nothing, just the same oppressive quiet. Bracing myself, I climbed the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the silence was pressing down on me. At the top of the stairs, I turned on the hallway light, illuminating the narrow space that led to his room. But the light did nothing to calm my racing heart. I could feel an ominous presence in the air, something dark and cold. Finally, I reached his bedroom door, which was closed. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle, dreading what might be on the other side. Summoning every ounce of courage, I knocked softly. "Dad, are you there?" Again, silence. My hand trembled as I slowly turned the door handle and pushed the door open. The room was pitch dark, the only light a faint glow from the hallway behind me. His room was large, and the switch was a few steps inside. I'd have to walk through the darkness to turn it on. As I stepped into the room, I could barely make out shapes in the dimness. My pulse quickened, and I moved toward the switch, reaching out with one shaking hand. Just as my fingers found the switch, I heard it, a sickening, crunching sound coming from the closet. I froze, every instinct telling me to run. But I couldn't move, paralyzed by a chilling dread. That sound, it was like something heavy and wet being torn apart. My stomach churned as I took a step back, trying to force myself to stay calm, to think rationally. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible, hoping against hope that it was somehow him. But I knew, deep down, that it couldn't be. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I edged closer to the closet. The door was slightly open and a chain dangled from the light inside. The thought of pulling that chain made my blood run cold, but I had to know. I reached out, grabbed the door handle, and slowly opened it wider. For a second, I thought I saw something, a flash of red, dark and thick like blood. And then the closet was empty, just an ordinary dark space. But there, on the closet floor, lying in a dark stain, was my father's old watch, the one my mother had given him before she died. He wore it every day, never took it off, as long as I could remember. I collapsed to my knees, staring at the watch, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. It lay there, silent and still, like a terrible omen. A wave of nausea hit me, and I could barely breathe. The horror of it all was sinking in, choking me with a suffocating fear. I didn't know how long I sat there, kneeling on the floor, unable to move. Minutes, hours, it was all a blur. At some point, I managed to pull myself together enough to get to my feet. I stumbled downstairs, my mind blank with shock, and picked up the phone, dialing 911 with numb fingers. The rest of that night was a haze of flashing lights, voices, and shadows moving in and out of the house. Sheriff Collins and his deputies questioned me over and over, but my words felt distant, as though I were watching someone else tell the story. The hours that followed were a blur. Sheriff Collins and his deputies moved through the house, searching every corner, while I sat in a daze, answering their questions mechanically. They asked me repeatedly about the girl, about my father, about every detail I could remember from the drive back home. I could see the doubt in their eyes, as if they thought I had imagined it all, or worse, that I was somehow involved. They spent days combing through the house and the surrounding desert. They brought in cadaver dogs, called for backup from other towns, and searched every inch of land within a mile of our home. But I knew, deep down, I knew, they wouldn't find him. Whatever had taken my father, whatever had appeared to us in the form of that little girl, had vanished as mysteriously as it had come, leaving nothing behind but his watch and the chilling memory of that night. In the weeks that followed, they sent me to live with my Aunt Rose in Albuquerque. She tried her best to help me heal, to bring me back to some semblance of normalcy, but I was changed. I could hardly sleep, and every shadow seemed to hold a pair of watchful eyes. My aunt arranged for me to see a psychologist who asked endless questions, probing my memories and fears. But even with all the questions, the therapy sessions, and the attempts to move forward, I could never let go of what I'd seen that night. Years passed, and I grew up carrying the weight of that memory, replaying it over and over in my mind. I would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the crunching sound from the closet, or seeing glimpses of that little girl standing silently in the shadows. I never told anyone the full story again, afraid they'd think I was crazy, or worse, that they'd pity me. Now, as an adult, I sometimes return to Truth or Consequences, wandering the old desert roads near our house. I know I'll never find my father, and yet I feel drawn back as if something is waiting there, unfinished. And though I try to convince myself that it's all in the past, that I'm safe now, I can't shake the feeling that the girl in the desert hasn't forgotten me. I sense that one day, when I least expect it, she'll come back. For more chilling horror stories, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.